different responses over the centuries to what happened on the cross. And a similarly intense topic for today is, where is God in suffering? Most Christians would agree that God is good, that God is just, that God is love. And most Christians would probably also say that God is all powerful, right? Omnipotent, all knowing, omniscient. So in the face of that, why does evil and suffering exist? Or sort of, where is God in that? Is God the one who causes suffering or whatnot? That's what we're going to talk about today. Oh, hello, William. In Louisiana, awesome. I'm interested in this topic because I am a Christian, ex-atheist, ex-evangelical Christian, deconstructing and reconstructing stuff continuously. Awesome, I'm glad you're here, and I feel you on the deconstructing and reconstructing continuously. Yeah, totally. So yeah, thanks for being here. I'm going to get us started. If people come in, feel free to keep on adding comments, but I'm going to start with a prayer before, doing more, I guess, housekeeping stuff, like what to expect. But let's start with a prayer that is a reading from the book of Habakkuk, which is one of the more, I think, obscure prophets. Like, most people haven't read this book. It's really short. It's only 3 chapters long. I tend to, when I'm feeling extra despairing about the state of the world, such as, for instance, maybe this week when things are just going so wrong everywhere, Habakkuk is one of my favorite prophets to revisit again and again, because I feel like he really gets it. The sense of despair and even frustration about why unjust people are able to gain control and enact violence upon the vulnerable. So I'm going to read a little bit from mostly chapter 1, and then the tiny bit of the beginning of chapter 2 is what this prayer is from. It's abridged, so it's not the whole chapter, but yeah, let's pray. Oh, I'm sorry, before. I'm going to try to do visual descriptions of any images on pages for anyone who isn't able to see them. I'll try and remember to describe them visually. Oh, and yeah, okay, so Jamie, hello, Jamie's here, yay. In Arizona. This has always been one of the more significant questions in my faith life, and I think there's an endless array of meaningful answers. Agreed, yeah. It's definitely one of the main questions I ask. Yeah. Yeah, felt that in my chest about, yeah. This has been a really heavy week. And while I don't think I'm going to bring up current events in a ton of detail, if y'all in the comments want to as we go, if you see connections to the stuff I'm bringing up, please feel free to, because it all sucks really bad, but it does help to talk about it, and not have to hold it in. So yeah, on that note, let's get to Habakkuk. The image I have here is an illustration of someone who is wearing, I guess, ancient clothing, right? And his back is to us. He's standing in front of a star-filled sky, and he's waving a torch. And so that's the image. Let us pray. Living God, how long will I cry for help, and you will not listen? I cry out to you, violence, but you don't save us. Why do you show me injustice and make me look at anguish so that devastation and violence are before me? There is strife and conflict abounds. The law is ineffective. Justice does not last because the wicked surround the just. Justice comes out warped. Why would you observe the treacherous or keep silent when the wicked one swallows up one who is more just? You made humans like the fish of the sea. The Chaldean drags them away in a net. He collects them in his fishing net. Should he continue to empty his net and continue to slay nations without sparing them? I will take up my post. I will set myself firm on the parapet. I will keep a watch to see what the living God says to me and how they will respond to my protest. Amen, Habakkuk. Like, literally me all week. Just, God, what is going on? So to go back to the images that were on these slides, there's this like pencil black and white drawing of a figure in a skirt and long hair, like surrounded by water on like a tiny little rock, raising their hands up to a stormy sky. And then the second image is someone sort of submerged in waves reaching up. This is actually an art piece of Peter, like, you know, in the Gospels when Peter like tries to walk on water and slips, but I thought it was a fitting image. And then the last is an art piece of Habakkuk standing on his parapet, looking up towards the heavens. It's a white dude image, and we know this guy would not have been white, but I could not find a lot of good art of this guy, and he's like one of my favorite poets, so I was kind of sad I couldn't find anything super good for him. But yeah, let's get going. So yeah, just to repeat in case there's any more folks who have entered. As we go, feel free to comment anything, and I'll try and keep track of the comments. If anything happens to the video or the sound, please definitely let me know that so I can fix that, so you're not like watching me talk soundlessly or looking at a blank screen or whatever. Feel free to share if you join and you want to say like hello. Feel free. If you have questions, either like I say something that you're like, that makes no sense, Avery, please clarify. Feel free to have those kinds of questions, or more like, I guess, subject content questions. Totally welcome. As we go and we look at all these different like responses to the question of suffering, one of the things that I like to focus on is what are like the good and the bad of all of these. All these responses have things that are good about them and limitations. So if you notice any of that, feel free to throw that into a comment. If you feel like anything relates to your personal life, feel free to share anecdotes. And if you need like an emotions check, or you want to just share any emotions that any of this content brings up for you, I think that's always really good to do, to just remember as we're going to be looking at like a lot of information, just making sure that, you know, you're connecting your emotions to that, and paying attention to what your mind and your body are feeling as we go through this. Oh yeah, and if I say anything like incorrect, or you think I should add some more details and you know about the subject, feel free to throw in more information. For this, since I'm trying to make this not be like a million hours long, I am like, a lot of this is heavily simplified, so I tried not to like overcomplicate things. But if you think I skipped something or made things too simple, that's totally fine to throw in. William's asking who made the Peter portrait. Let's see. I'll share a source for that in the once this has posted and is up. I'll make sure to add that to the notes, the link, because I don't remember, but I put a link in my notes, so I can do that. But yeah, okay. So let's get started. Question of where the heck is God in suffering? And like I mentioned, as we go, paying attention to the consequences. So paying attention to what's good about these different like theologies or ideas, and what could potentially be limitations to them, or especially what consequences do they have in real life. I think a lot of times theologians and philosophers and scholars like myself get too much in our heads and into like the abstract, and we forget to look up and see how theologies aren't just pretty little thoughts, right? They have real life consequences out in the world. And so if theology yields harm, it's not good theology. It doesn't matter how smart it sounds or how good it sounds, or even that you can like pull up some verses in the Bible for it. If it's causing harm, that's not the Jesus that we know. As Jesus says in Luke 6, and a few other Gospels as well, he says, A good tree does not produce bad fruit, nor does a bad tree produce good fruit. Each tree is known by its own fruit. So definitely welcome you to share any thoughts on any of these different theologies of how you see how they could potentially actually bring like real life impacts into the world. So yeah. And to get us started, before we dive into some of the different responses people have to the question of suffering, I'm going to start with a Bible story. Yay. There's a short little bit in Luke chapter 13. It's just the first 5 verses where Jesus, in the previous chapters leading up to this, has been preaching, teaching to crowds of people. And at this point, some of them come up to Jesus and they have a question for him. They bring up a current event that must have happened relatively recently, and they ask him about it. And like, honestly, if I could meet Jesus, I totally get why they did this. I would also be the one coming up like, hey, Jesus, what is with this thing that just happened? So what they ask him is, hey, Jesus, Pilate, so Pontius Pilate, the Roman ruler placed over Judah, apparently executed some Galileans while they were sacrificing in the temple. So people from Galilee, which is where Jesus is from and most of his disciples are from, it's this sort of like nearby region next to Judah that is sort of known for being a bit like country, which is fun. But this story shows some Galileans going to the temple to worship God, right, and to sacrifice, and Roman powers executed them while they were in the midst of worship. And so you can imagine the people bringing this news to Jesus, wondering why these people, why did God let them die, especially while they were worshiping? Was there some sort of like secret sin in their hearts, right, that God had to punish them for, or what? Well, Jesus' response is to say, do you think the suffering of these Galileans proves that they were more sinful than all the other Galileans? And then he also brings up another news story. He says, here's something else that happened. A tower collapsed in Siloam, and it killed 18 people who were inside. And he asks, do you think they were more guilty of wrongdoing than everyone else who lives in Jerusalem? So for me, this story sort of does 2 things. It shows that we can bring these questions to Jesus, to God, and we can say, why did this happen? What's going on here? Why did this suffering take place? But for whatever reason, Jesus doesn't give a clear-cut answer, right? He doesn't tell them why the suffering happened. He only tells them why it didn't happen. He says it's not because these people sinned. It wasn't a punishment. But why doesn't he why is that all he answers, right? And so as we explore, one of the main things that you'll see today is that there are no easy answers. There are no neat and definitive answers. Jesus doesn't offer one, and I definitely can't offer one. And if you find someone who is offering a really easy, definitive answer, it's probably more harmful than helpful. So yeah, as we go, asking the questions is awesome, and also knowing that like we're not going to have the answer, but here with Jesus we see that even though God doesn't give us the correct answer, God does tell us what is definitely wrong. It's definitely wrong to blame the victims. It's definitely incorrect to say it's about sin or punishment. So yeah, before we move on from this story, let me see what y'all have been saying in the comments. Annie's saying, oh yeah, so on the topic of like making sure we pay attention to real consequences, that's why I always have to remind myself to return when I get tangled up in my head. A good theology is ultimately the one that produces good fruit. And love is love. If it is helping the person you're loving live their best and most abundant life, yeah. I'm so grateful to those people for asking Jesus this question. Me too. His answer is fascinating. Yeah, it's weird. And I invite you to look at this story more in depth on your own if you're interested. I always learn something from these stories. Yeah, it's an interesting story, and it's like both. I find it helpful and also like it is frustrating. Like sometimes when I get so frustrated and the world is just so overwhelming. I wish that Jesus would give us a nice, easy answer, but ultimately I think it's powerful that he doesn't, that we are instead invited to like wrestle and ask the questions, even if it gets really annoying sometimes to not just know. But yeah, one other thing that this Jesus story brings up for me is the distinction that I'm not going to go into too much today, but I want to mention it at the front, and y'all feel free to sort of bring it up in the chat, is moral evil versus natural evil. So people tend to divide, and by people I mean like a lot of like theologians and philosophers and stuff will divide evil or suffering into the moral stuff, so suffering that humans inflict, pain and evil that exist in the world because of us. And then there's natural evil, so things like natural disasters, viruses, famine, suffering that human beings experience, and also like not just humans but like all life, right? All the kind of suffering that living beings experience at the hands of the natural world. Well, that gets complicated to me, and like one reason I'm not going to go into it too much is, first of all, a lot of times moral and natural evil are super intertwined. Think about like climate change. Things that are natural disasters like hurricanes are at the hands of nature, right? Like they are natural disasters, but they're increasing in frequency and intensity because of human activity in the world. So to me, sort of, sometimes it makes sense to separate these two kinds of evil or suffering, and then other times it doesn't work. Oh, hi, Q. Q just joined. I can't stay long. That's totally fine. I'm glad you're here. I won't be talking too much about natural evil this time around. We're going to be mostly focused on what is usually considered the moral evil, the suffering that humans inflict. But the natural stuff will come up too. The main thing for me is, and I'm totally interested if any of y'all know of any like resources or whatever about when it comes to sort of responses to natural evil, whether that's Christian responses or not. I really like that there seems to be less. I'm like extra dissatisfied with the question of why suffering that is sort of like just natural exists. Like I understand moral evil, I understand why humans hurt each other and stuff. That's what we're gonna get into more. But why the natural stuff? For both of these, most Christians, traditional theology blames Adam and Eve, of course. It's the fall, it's original sin. And again, I'm not going to talk about that much today, except to say a lot of theology around Adam and Eve and original sin is not super satisfying for me. And if y'all are interested, I could totally do a live stream that's just about Genesis 1 through 4, like Adam and Eve and all of that story, and talking about original sin versus original blessing. But today, probably not going to get to talk about that too much. But I wanted to throw it out here because if you research these questions of evil and suffering, these terms will come up a lot. We're going to get into actual responses, finally, right, to the question of how a good God could possibly let bad things happen. And I really like how Wendy Farley describes the sort of theology that answers this question that is called Theodicy. So Theodicy, it's not the Odyssey like the Greek book, right? It's it's Theo, so God, and then the second half of the Greek means like justify. So it's, when you pick it apart, the word means to justify God. And so it's an attempt to prove that God is indeed still good and just, even though there's evil and suffering. That's what Theodicy is. And so this is what theologian Wendy Farley says about Theodicy. She says, it is usually the intellectual effort to jerry-rig three mutually exclusive terms into harmony: divine power, goodness, and the experiences of evil. This is most often done by denying or undermining the reality of one of the three terms. Hence my little image that is going to follow us throughout this live stream of this triangle that is put together, popsicle sticks, very sort of like shabbily taped together with duct tape. And one side says God is good and just, Another side says God is all powerful, and another side says evil and suffering exist. So these, according to Farley and a lot of other people, these don't go together well. Attempting to tape them together and make them fit takes a lot of adjusting and like weird like mental gymnastics and stuff. And so that's what we're talking about. When theologians or anyone else attempt to make these three sides fit together, like Farley says, they usually have to pick one of the sides to sort of, she says, deny or undermine. I think also it doesn't always have to be like saying that the thing doesn't exist at all, or but it is sort of choosing. I imagine it as like if you had a three-legged stool and one of the legs is like your sticks are the legs are not lined up. One of them's going to be wiggly. You have to pick which of them you're willing to be wiggly, which one you're going to let wobble. So are you going to say that maybe God's not as powerful as we thought? Or are you going to say, oh, maybe God's not as good as we thought? Or are you going to say, ooh, maybe evil isn't as bad as we think, which is wild, but that's actually where we're starting in a moment. So yeah, as we go through these slides, we're gonna do what different scholars do and choose one side at a time to let wobble and see how people do that. But right before doing that, I did want to bring up this quote from Epicurus. Well, it's actually a paraphrase of David Hume. So this guy that is going to come up in a moment on his own, this scholar brought Epicurus into this question and sort of made this paraphrase of a quote by this Greek philosopher from the 300s BCE, famous. So what Epicurus said, and of course he was not a Christian, Christianity didn't exist, he was not Jewish, he was Greek, but which shows that even outside of what we're going to be looking at today, which is biblical thought and then Jewish and Christian thinkers, people in all different religions and all different sort of regions and cultures are asking this question of, if there's some sort of higher power or multiple higher powers, what is their impact or interaction with suffering? So he says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? So yeah, that question of, if God is completely good and all-powerful, why doesn't God just keep the evil from happening? So to start with, the first side we're going to sort of scrutinize is the question of whether God is really good and just. Evil and suffering exist. We can clearly see that in our world. And for now, we're going to say that God is all-powerful and sees and knows everything. So then, God must not be omnibenevolent, must not be all good and all just. Now, this viewpoint, I didn't find many like Christians arguing for this, or any monotheists at all, really. Especially Christians, though, because God being good is pretty big staple of the faith. So we're largely going to be looking at non-Christian, like mostly like atheist or secular ideas of this, starting with, like I brought up just a moment before, David Hume. So he was this Scottish philosopher in the late 1700s who asked the question of whether God is good or whether God exists at all, and all of that. So what he says is, God's power, we allow, is infinite. Whatever he wills is executed, but neither man nor any other animal are happy. Therefore, he does not will their happiness. His wisdom is infinite. He is never mistaken in choosing the means to any end, but the course of nature tends not to human or animal felicity. Therefore, it is not established for that purpose. In what respect, then, do his benevolence and mercy resemble the benevolence and mercy of men? I mainly threw this quote in here because that last bit sort of adds some complications to this, right? So Hume, instead of saying flat out, God must not be good, Hume suggests, if God is good and merciful, then God's goodness and mercy is not anything like human goodness and mercy. And when I showed this quote to my wife Leah last night, and she's an ex-evangelical, right? She was raised in this very fundamentalist form of Christianity. She said that kind of reminds her of stuff that she learned growing up, that God is all good, and therefore if you go through something bad, or for instance a church has teachings that to you seem bad or even abusive, well, that's just because God's goodness sometimes looks like pain to us. Do any of y'all have experiences with that, or have any thoughts on that idea that, oh, God's all good, but maybe God's goodness looks cruel to us? I hope none of y'all are surprised in hearing that. I think that is terrible, terrible, terrible thing to say, because when we look at the consequences of that kind of theology, we see a lot of suffering. For instance, that's the kind of thing that could enable slavery or domestic abuse or homophobia, queerphobia, or just all these things, that you can tell someone that they're experiencing suffering while being in your church because sometimes God's love looks like pain. It just it also, to me, just Q saying, yeah, the way benevolence of God being another level to the human one is a theology I came across, but not in a cruel way. That's just, yeah. And he says, I have experiences with that. That's what I was taught all my life, and it was a great contributor to my religious trauma. Yeah, I'm so sorry. And I hate that. I think that's unfortunately fairly common. And it makes sense, because if you can convince people, I mean, it is, I know people overuse the term gaslighting, but I do feel like it is a sort of communal gaslighting of telling people that if they're experiencing something as hate and pain, no, they're wrong, and to insist that what you're going through is pain or is abuse, when they're telling you it's actually of God, you're the one in the wrong then, right? It's a really good way to keep people scared and in your faith community. Laura says, this may be totally incorrect, but I feel like there's not much work on classic Theodicy that comes from a group. Oh, sorry for that noise if you heard that. Motorcycle driving by. Yes and no. We'll get to some. I don't know about classic Theodicy. I think you are right. Yeah, so Theodicy meaning justifying God, like we have to prove that God is indeed a good guy. Not as much from oppressed groups, but looking at the question of suffering, totally something oppressed people are doing. So we'll be getting to that. Fear not. William says 100% the idea that God wills the suffering and it is simply beyond our comprehension was a very prevalent idea to me growing up. Yeah, it's... Annie says, that teaching directly led to me self-gaslighting myself in several abusive friendships and family relationships to believe I deserved the cruel treatment I was receiving. Yeah. It sets you up to be a victim of abuse, whether by God or by other humans, because it teaches you are worthless and deserve the pain you're being given. Yeah. And like when we see in Scripture, God willing the abundance and the liberation of people, especially when we look at Jesus coming into the world and attempting to liberate people from these sort of systems that keep them captive. It just, it makes me furious that people use this idea of God as good and they take it and they twist it into something so harmful. It's wild and it's terrible. Jamie says, in Eastern Christian thought, they usually divide God's will into an ontological will and an economic will, which essentially is ideally God doesn't want bad things, but since we messed up, God allows badness because it ultimately contributes to the salvation for all. Ooh, we're gonna get to something similar to that in a while. Not from an Eastern Christian view though, so thanks for throwing that in there. That's something that is present in the Eastern Church. Cool. We'll be getting to that idea in a bit. But first, I'm not gonna linger on this too long because, well, you'll see. Dystheism is from the Greek like discord, like bad. God is bad is basically what this phrase means. It's like a term that you can stick onto any instance of people saying, yeah, God is not God is either evil or bad, or at least not completely good, is what dystheism is. And so for theists, people who do believe in a god or gods, I'm pretty sure this is way more common for polytheistic religions, right? Because if you have a whole array of gods, you can say that maybe one of them is the bad god or the trickster, which doesn't have to be all bad, right? But at least not all good. The closest, I think, for most Christians to this idea is not that there's an evil god, but Satan, right? Like that part of why evil exists is that there's some sort of devil figure who's bringing that evil into the world. God is still all good, but the devil, who is powerful, but not God, of course. Like, so for Christians who emphasize Satan stuff, they're going to say that's where the evil comes from. So I think that's the closest in sort of like main Christian groups that have anything like this idea. But back in the day, in the first, the earliest few centuries of Christianity, we do have some ideas that include a god being evil. And so we have the Gnostics, and we have Marcion, who is not a Gnostic, but when it comes to this idea, is pretty close in agreement with the Gnostics. So the Gnostics were Christians who said that and they were influenced by Greco-Roman thought in this. They had a really strong binary between the physical and the spiritual. And the spiritual is all good, and it's what we should strive for, and the physical is completely evil. We are not made, to quote Yoda, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, right? That all this physical stuff is bad, and it's weighing us down, and we, God's going to liberate us from that. But not the God who created the material world, right? That's the demiurge, the creator of the material universe, is not the God of Jesus, right? This is just some lesser God who made the physical world, but then the God of Jesus breaks into that physical world to set us free into the spiritual. For me, the consequences of saying that the physical is all bad is that it leads people to sort of discount physical suffering, as well as like physical differences, and the diversity of our physical bodies, and probably other stuff too, if anyone else has thoughts on just, how this can have some bad fruit in the world. Luckily, both the Gnostics and Marcion got sort of, voted down by fellow Christians, though I do think that some of their ideas live on, in the idea that the God of the Old Testament is somehow different from the God of the New Testament. Unfortunately, that viewpoint is pretty prevalent to an extent, even if people don't say it's it's literally a different God. They do see God as mean and cruel in the Old Testament, and then I guess mellows out when he has a kid because he's nice in the New Testament. And I'm using he because that tends to be the viewpoint. But yeah, the image I have, the one image here is a piece that depicts the two gods of Zoroastrianism, which is a religion in which there is a god who is good and a god who is evil, and they're locked in this cosmic battle. And so that's more common, like I said, than when you just have one god to have a god who's evil, right? And then in atheist views, there is more prevalence, I think, of the dystheism idea of if there were a god, that god would be evil. For instance, Mikhail Bakunin was this 19th century Russian anarchist who says, if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. So he looked at all the bad stuff going on in the world, as well as like the more problematic stuff in scripture, and said, yeah, that God would be bad. So we're like, if he exists, we don't like him. And then if anyone's interested in this topic, you could Google the Evil God Challenge. Let's see, I think starting in like the 1950s or something, there were philosophers who basically, it's not like a TikTok challenge, right? It's not like the cinnamon challenge. It's a challenge as in like Like the trolley problem is a challenge, right? Can you solve this logical puzzle? It's the question of Theodicy, right? Can you prove that God is good and powerful if evil exists? So if you're interested in looking more, that's a term you can look up. I'll keep going though, and back into like theist views, but let me check what y'all are saying. Ella says, this interests me because the idea that God's justice and mercy don't look human seems meaningful to me. Right, yeah, oh yeah, so back to, yeah. But then it gets twisted into your experiences of suffering isn't valid. Right, yeah, like the idea that God is beyond our ability to comprehend makes total sense to me. And, you know, is in scripture that God says, like, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. But yeah, to twist that into I'm meaner than you is just, oh yeah, it's really, it's bad. Annie, we cannot separate the physical and the spiritual elements of ourselves because they're so intertwined. Right, yeah. And doing that can lead to bad fruit, such as self-hate of our physical side, etc. Yeah, and like a sort of sense of dissociation, and like to feel like, I don't know about y'all, but I have felt disconnect from my physical self, and for various reasons, including dysphoria. Just, it's already hard to connect to my body, and a lot of people experience that in this world that tells us our bodies are broken or ugly or any number of things. It's already hard enough to love your body without also being told that, yeah, that's fine because breaking away from it is what God wants anyway. And not like a TikTok challenge, can you imagine, says William, like, how evil can God be? Record it. Yeah. Let's get the evil God challenge trending. Okay, I'm in if y'all are in. But yeah, moving on. We already talked about this, the idea that I ended up doing that before, so I'll keep going. So that's all I had for like picking at the God is good side, because like I said, Christians don't do it as much. So we'll spend more time with scrutinizing the evil side, right? Which is wild. When I told my wife this, like, that I was like, yeah, there's actually a lot of stuff to say about people who pick apart evil and suffering exist, she was like, what? Like, suffering clearly exists. Look at the state of the world. Like, people get sick and die, climate disaster. Like, how do people say there's no suffering? Well, most people don't say suffering doesn't exist, but they find ways to say that suffering's not so bad, or it can be used as a lesson. So that's mainly what we're going to look at. But I will start with Christian Science apparently does claim that evil and suffering just flat out don't exist. Now, obviously, I'm not in I'm not a Christian Scientist, which, if you don't know, that is like the name. It's not scientists who are Christians. It is like a religious sect that is called Christian Science that was founded by Mary Baker Eddy, I think, in like the late 1800s. And yeah, I don't want to misrepresent them because I really don't know a lot about them. But she says, the founder says, when the illusion of sickness or sin tempts you, cling steadfastly to God and his idea. Allow nothing but his likeness to abide in your thought. Oh yeah, Laura, I'm sorry. Yeah, I totally understand if you've got to tune out for, yeah, it is, this is an intense topic, so it's totally fine if you gotta, tune out. Thanks for being here, and yeah, I totally, yeah, it's, this kind of, like, a lot of this theology is more harmful. If you want, I could message you once, like, as we get closer to the end of the slides, like, we're gonna move into what, at least for me, is the more, like, affirming theology, the theology that has good fruit, right? But it is for a little bit going through some of the, stuff that has the more negative consequences, including stuff that could be triggering. So if anyone else needs to step out and come back in like 20-30 minutes, we'll be back to hopefully the more like the stuff that has, better impact on the world. So yeah, But yeah, so we've got suffering doesn't exist. And then, yeah, for me, one issue with that is, of course, it sort of, again, has this gaslighting idea of if you're going through pain, you're experiencing any kind of pain, including like flat out like being sick or dying. Christian Science apparently claims that it's an illusion, which sort of dismisses pain and suffering. And then there are philosophers who say the other thing is, even if this were true, well, couldn't God make it so these illusions didn't exist, right? So it doesn't particularly hold up from that angle either. But more common is the idea of suffering existing, but having sort of like it's justified, right? Like, yes, there's suffering, but not all suffering is evil. A lot of suffering is indeed caused by God, and it's justified. This is way more common, right? And in the Bible, there are examples of it. So the Bible is a collection of so many different writers, right, attempting to describe their experiences with God and their understanding of God. And so there are different points of view. And some of those points of view include this idea of suffering as punishment. So it's often called temporal retribution, the idea that people get what they deserve in their lifetime, that you will be rewarded or punished by God while you're still on earth. So in Hosea, you have this idea, right, that because Israel has broken their covenant with God, that's why God says, I will drive them from my land. I will love them no more because of all their leaders are rebels. And that also has the idea that even though it's human powers, right, like empire that comes in and commits violence against Israel and Judah, the author of Hosea sees God as being the one sort of orchestrating that human violence as a way of punishing Israel and Judah, which is, for me, I mean, for one thing, it sort of negates human will in this, right? That it's God who's doing, like, God's letting say the Assyrians or the Babylonians do this evil stuff, so they're not to blame, right? Elie says, again, there's something interesting there in the idea that suffering and death are not part of IDK, a true spiritual order, and are not as real permanent. Oh yeah, about sort of like claiming that like suffering and death are illusions, right? Yeah, I think it almost takes the idea that someday we will, like, we hope, most Christians believe that at some point in the future, suffering will end, right? That pain and death and evil will no longer exist. But while they do exist here and now, pretending they don't just hurts people and dismisses their pain. Hi, Rebecca from Germany. Oh, cool. I joined a little bit late. Yeah, no, that's totally fine. We're going through different responses to the question of suffering, and we're on suffering as punishment, which, yeah, like, it's an intense topic. We're gonna get to the theologies that I at least find have a less harm in the world, but for now we are looking at some that have some harm in the world. So Ella says, punishment as justice seems like another way of making God an abusive parent. Yeah, the idea that God is the one who causes bad things to happen in order to punish us, and then usually it's not just to punish, but also, like in Hosea, the punishment is supposed to get you to turn back to God. It is very much an abusive cycle, which is, yeah, another reason that I find it really harmful and not worthwhile. And we'll get to in a second biblical authors who agree that, maybe the idea of suffering as punishment doesn't actually work out too well. But first, I do think that it's interesting to kind of think about why, for some people, including biblical authors like Hosea, why the idea of suffering being punishment, how could that possibly ever be a comforting thing? David M. Carr writes about this in his book Holy Resilience, the Bible's Traumatic Origins, and I found it really helpful for when exploring parts of Scripture, mostly in the Hebrew Bible, including like a lot of the prophets. I found it really helpful to think about the context of why these human authors would think this way. So he talks about how it is a trauma response, that it's very common in both individuals and on larger scales to sort of try to regain any sense of control over your situation when you're experiencing something traumatic, because one of the main things that trauma does is it strips you of control, right? So a lot of people in abusive situations sort of attempt to have some sense of agency by saying, oh, well, if it's my fault, I can change my behavior and it will get this person to stop hurting me, or this group to stop hurting me, or stop oppressing me. And of course, the problem is that that's not how abuse actually works, that it's not about the person being harmed. It really is. It's the choice and the actions of the abusers or the oppressors. But I think, I don't place any, you don't want to place any judgment on people going through the trauma for doing what they have to do to survive it and get out of it. So no judgment when people do experience this idea. And so looking at these different biblical authors like the prophet Hosea in this light helped me sort of have like more compassion for them, even while disagreeing with what their theology is, their image of God, for the most part, seeing that their idea of God as a punisher who like uses violence to get people to return to them, like, it's not for me. But it sort of helped me understand why they were going there. For these people so the nations of Israel and Judah were really small, and a lot of different empires across the centuries and even the millennia wanted their land and their resources. And these empires were way bigger. They had the power to subjugate Israel and Judah pretty easily. Well, if these oppressors were sent by God, then we know that God cares about us. We can get God to change their mind and save us. If it's just humans being humans, we don't have much control over them. This random emperor, like in Rome or Babylon, doesn't give a crap about us. We can't sway him. And so to me, it makes sense that they're finding sort of a sense of control. Alice says, that is interesting and horrifying. Guilt as a way of coping with a world that is totally beyond your control. Yeah, it's really... It's really sad, and I think in light of the fact that a lot of people experiencing things like abuse sort of have this way of coping, the best thing that communities around them can do is to help them break out of their isolation and find places where they can recover in healthy ways. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about that. Just for me, it helps sort of not justify views of God as a punisher, but sort of explain them when that God is being pictured by people who are oppressed. Meanwhile, we see people who are doing the oppressing or doing the abusing take that punisher God and wield that image of God as a weapon. And obviously, that's a completely different thing. I don't feel for people who do that. That does not justify people doing that at all. So let's get to biblical critiques of suffering as punishment. So as you read the Bible, you're not only going to find places that sort of imply that God is the one that causes suffering, you're also going to find plenty of authors who say, hang on, wait a second, I don't think so. For instance, there's lots of examples of people who are innocent, who didn't do anything wrong, who are even described as righteous by the authors, who still suffer. Catholics have Tobit in the book of Tobit, who he is described, like the whole first chapter of Tobit, which isn't in the Protestant Bible, but it's really good. You should read it if you want a fun time. For instance, Tobit is this guy who's described as super righteous, super faithful and devout. Well, one day he sits down to take a nap in his own courtyard, and bird poop falls in his eyes while he's sleeping, and he goes blind. I guess shit happens sometimes, literally, right? That natural disasters or accidents just happen. It's not God causing them. It's not God punishing you. Sometimes shit literally just happens in Tobit's case. Or with Ruth and Naomi, their story starts with a description of famine that kills their husbands and children, I think. So it doesn't say that God's the one who sent the famine. It just kind of happens. So those are examples of that natural evil, right? Things that just kind of happen by nature. And then there's human violence, right? There's stories in the Bible of humans causing suffering, and it's not because the people who are suffering sinned or anything, right? It's just because humans chose to hurt them, right? So yeah, the John 9 verses here. Oh wait, no, I lied. First, the Matthew 5:1. Jesus says, God makes the sun rise on both the evil and the good, and sends rain on both the just and the unjust. So his sort of response to the idea that if something good happens to you, it's because you're a good person. If something bad happens to you, it's because you're a bad person. No, life's way more complicated than that, for better or worse. And then, yeah, in John 9, it's a famous story of Jesus and his disciples coming across a man who is begging, and he was born blind. So the disciples say, Rabbi, who sinned so that this man was born blind? This man or his parents? And Jesus answers, neither he nor his parents, right? That Jesus is saying, no, this isn't the result of sin. Sometimes things just happen. Let's see what Ellis is saying. Yeah. God as the abuser is not my kind of theology, so I'm glad that we have responses in Scripture that also say, God as abuser doesn't really fit our experience of who God is. And of course, one of the most famous examples of a biblical response against the idea of suffering being a punishment is the book of Job, which was written, I think, if you were raised in like a more fundamentalist group that taught you that every part of the Bible needs to be taken literally, you might not know this, but whoever wrote the book of Job intended for it to be read as a fiction. Like, there are parts of the Bible, like, that are meant more as histories in a sense. But the book of Job was always meant to be seen as a story, almost like a super long parable. And it's just the author taking the question of why do good people suffer and turning it into the story that does involve God and Satan, and all of that, but it's meant to be read as a fiction, right? And I won't dwell for this live stream on the whole Satan thing, but basically we see Job, who is this man who is described as a righteous guy. He's a good guy. He moves from being super prosperous to being super poor, and he's suffering. His whole family dies except his wife. I think the roof of his house collapses, his livestock all die, and he becomes ill. He is covered in sores. And so, of course, his neighbors find, oh my gosh, I see Andy saying the book of Job is intended as a story. Yes. If you get yourself a study Bible or find like scholarly commentary on Job online, scholars will tell you, the way this is written is clearly a story. It was never meant to be read as like Job being a real guy. But anyway, same with Jonah, by the way, if anyone cares, and same with Tobit for anyone who has the Catholic Bible. These were all meant to be read as stories. Like, the authors never meant people to believe it was a real person. But anyway, Job's neighbors assume that he sinned. They sit with him in silence for a while, which is great, and they just sit and they suffer with him, and that's beautiful. And then they start asking what he did to earn this suffering, right? Well, Job refuses to say that he did anything wrong because he didn't. And so in the book On Job by Gustavo Gutierrez, who is a liberation theologian from Latin America, he's super cool. In his book, he calls Job a rebellious believer. He refuses to do what Satan wants him to do and what his wife tells him to do, which is to curse God and die, right? He refuses to curse God. He's going to remain faithful, but he demands an answer from God. I love that. William's also like, this is new to me too. Yeah, glad to blow y'all's minds. I'll note to self, I'll include at least one link about reading Job and certain other books of the Bible like Jonah from the lens of they were meant to be literature. But yeah, because I think it's good to know when we're looking at it, especially because a lot of people for the book of Job, they get really hung up on the idea of God engaging Satan in this context of like using Job as like a pawn in this game between God and Satan. There's a lot there that I won't go into, but I think it's helped at least a little bit to know that the author meant for it to be a story, so he wanted it to have this grand cosmic scale. But yeah, anyway, Job yells out to God and spends many chapters being like, God, get your butt down here and tell everybody I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know why I'm suffering, but it's not me. And God does. God comes and God responds and says, Job, you speak rightly. So God affirms Job in saying that his suffering is not a punishment. But God also goes on this really long poetic monologue about like, I made all of creation, and Gutierrez interprets God's response as saying basically this. And so this is a quote that Gutierrez gives to God. Do you persist in staying locked into a world of easy explanations? So he's asking, so God is asking Job, your demand to know why you suffer because you didn't do anything wrong. You're the one who thinks that suffering has to be about having done something wrong. So are you going to stay locked into that easy explanation? And God continues, are you trying to imprison my free and gratuitous love in your theological concepts? Do you want to make yourself judge of my actions? So yeah, like, just humans have this tendency to try to pigeonhole God and to make easy answers, right? That's good, and it's more complicated than that. This is a really this book on Job is really short, but like super dense, and like it is a harder read. I was thinking about maybe doing a short YouTube video, just like going through like the basics of it, because it was one of the harder, like less like more scholarly language type books that I had to read in seminary. So I might like having people to talk through it is more helpful, I think, than me telling you to just go read it yourself. But more stuff that Gutierrez says about the book of Job is that as Job suffers, he looks around and notices that other people are suffering too. And before, like back when Job was prosperous, he probably was completely content in this easy theology that the reason he is prosperous is because he's a good guy and nothing bad will ever befall him because he's not a sinner, right? So if there's someone suffering, well, he doesn't have to do much about it because it's their fault that they're suffering. Well, now that he's experiencing suffering himself without meriting it, he realizes that, oh, actually sometimes on earth we suffer for other people's sin, right? Sin is a corporate reality. It's not an individual thing. So I think for people who have the, like in our own modern times, the idea of like systemic sin or systemic injustice, right? That the systems we are stuck in and born into, like white supremacy or heteronormativity, these are sins or injustices or evils that cause us to suffer without it being our fault, right? It's sort of humanity's fault as a whole, and also not like just the complexity there, right? Instead of trying to figure out who to blame for any one instance of suffering. And yeah, Job notices other innocent people suffering around him, and as Gutierrez says, that Job learns to go out of himself and help other sufferers without waiting until his own problems are first resolved, and that's how you find a way to God. So I think that part for Gutierrez is really important because, again, he was in Latin America during the 1900s when so many different like government, authoritarian governments were like rising. People were being disappeared in the night, and in the face of that suffering, when your own suffering, your own loss, is fairly enough sort of becomes your whole world. Gutierrez says you do also have to look out. Like, you can take the time to like experience your own suffering and grief, but what will help you most is to realize that your grief is sort of within this larger matrix of grief that you can help with. Even while your problems still exist, you can help bring like ease suffering of others at the same time. instead of just wallowing, instead of just cursing God and dying, right? Instead of just giving up, you can do whatever little things you can to get active. And we'll turn back to that idea of how we respond to suffering even when we don't know why it happens in a while. But for now, to continue with other like ideas within the Bible, different biblical authors. First I'll see what Annie just wrote. I was taught that women's suffering is the result of feminism, right? And it's our own fault for seeking out greater equality and dignity and respect, and that is a harmful belief I still grapple with sometimes. Yeah, if anyone else has a response to that, what I would say is like, yeah, I've definitely heard stuff like that too, that you're bringing the pain upon yourself, and I think that's the way, I think it's when you're in a privileged group where you have the privilege to not notice someone else's pain. So for me, I'll use the example of, as a white person, I can easily choose to remain ignorant about the suffering of Black people in my country and in the world. And therefore, when they dare to speak up and make me hear about their suffering, to me, it might look like, oh, well, the reason they're suffering, the reason violence is happening to them is because they won't shut up, when really the suffering has been happening the whole time. I may not have seen it, but they've been encountering it all along. And so, like, yeah, clear, like, it's not because they're speaking out now, or louder, or in a way I finally, as a white person, hear, right? It was always there. And so, yeah, that's a frustrating argument people make, but really, if you dare to look beyond your own cushy, privileged, like, ignorance, it becomes obvious that this just isn't the case. Annie, it's so harmful when a marginalized person is told that seeking better for themselves is what causes their suffering, and not the systemic sin causing oppression. Yeah, absolutely. Or yeah, William saying, I was taught all suffering is ultimately due to Eve, the first woman. Okay, yeah, I really need to do a live stream if y'all like about Adam and Eve and stuff, because that drives me up a wall, but that's super prevalent. Ella says, that's such a specific and insidious power tool, too, that your suffering wouldn't exist if you didn't kick up a fuss about it, right? Yeah, no. Q says, I had people say that it was my own fault I experienced queer phobia when I could just choose to pass and not be loud about it. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was thinking, that, like, there are certain forms of oppression that people, like, that are less, like, they're super visible. I don't know that, like, a Black person can't pretend not to be Black for the most part, but people will say that about, like, queer folk, trans folk, gay folk, that you could choose, right? Like, I didn't have to cut my hair and start HRT and stuff. I didn't have to stand out. And, like, at this point, like, now that I've been on HRT for a long time, other people now say, well, now you could pretend, like, you could pass as a man. Well, I don't want to, right? Like, so it's our fault for standing out and not wanting to pass. It's just, that's unjust, right? And from a Christian perspective, one thing that brings me a lot of encouragement is seeing that Jesus stood out, and he didn't choose to be quiet about oppression, whether it was his own or others, right? He wasn't going to try to pass as a normal person, right? He was going to be loud about who he was, whether that's the Son of God or someone who brings good news, someone who can heal. People who wanted to shut him up did not succeed, and it was, what happened to him was not his fault. The result of him refusing to shut up was execution by Roman powers, but that doesn't make it his fault, right? It's not his fault they did that. It's theirs. It's the systemic injustice, even if he technically could have avoided it if he just was quiet. But yeah, so yeah. Continuing, yeah, thank you, y'all. This is very important stuff when it comes to suffering. That, again, like, this idea of, like, a lot of people are just really desperate to blame the victim, right? But that just perpetuates the injustice. It doesn't make it go away. Ellis says, a professor of mine talked about the standing outness, stigma as stigmata. Yes, stigma as stigmata. Yeah, those come from the same origin, being visibly set apart. Yeah, I actually just preached on this idea, preached on Thomas looking at Jesus's wounds. I talked about it from the perspective of marginalized bodies as spectacle, and it's I turned the sermon into a podcast episode, so I think it's episode 49 of my podcast. If anyone's interested in, I go into the complications of what is often called visibility politics, like, do we try to just shut up and blend in, or do we stand out? Well, Jesus, with his wounds and choosing to let his disciples interact with his wounds and instead of him covering them up, shows us that the things that the world says are our fault or make us broken, we're not the ones who have to try to conceal them, right? It's not on us to do that, right? That it's the world's job to to get used to us and to accept us and respect us and even celebrate us. But yeah, I'm gonna keep going, but feel free to keep the comments coming. But yeah, so to continue with biblical perspectives on suffering, there are, going back to, so moving sort of from suffering as punishment to something related to that, God orchestrating suffering to bring about good. So again, that idea that if an evil power invades Judah, it's because God sent that empire into Judah to teach Judah a lesson so that Judah will turn back to God. And so in the book of Amos, we have a little bit of this. I still love Amos. I still find a lot of what he says really meaningful. And he mostly talks about how it's oppressors. It's the people, the wealthy, who are causing the problems. But he does also say this, or he puts this idea, this is in Amos, God says, shall evil befall a city, and the Lord hath not done it? And I used the older English, not the old-fashioned English there, because John Calvin loved this verse. And if anyone has thoughts about this, like, this is something that we spent like an entire class period talking about one time in seminary, and I still don't really understand what Calvin likes about this. But because, like, to me, I hear this and think, oh, so evil's not our fault, it is God's fault. God is the one making the bad things happen so that we'll be good again, right? Like, so we've got this abuser God image, which I see as super harmful and not helpful at all, like we've been talking about. But John Calvin found it super comforting. He is, you might have heard of him when it comes to like predestination and stuff. He had this idea that like free will exists, but everything's also divinely determined, which I don't understand. Like, he says that it's both, that everything has two layers, human agency and divine agency, and somehow they work together. So for instance, my professor's example was, I picked this shirt, right? I picked to put this shirt on today before coming on this live stream. I'm the one who chose it. That was my free will, but also I wouldn't have chosen it if God didn't want me to choose it. It was divinely determined. I don't get how those coexist. And I also don't get how that doesn't sound creepy as heck. But to John Calvin, it wasn't creepy as heck. It was encouraging. And so in his own context, he had been exiled from his homeland, France. And I think he and his group, I think they went to Switzerland, is where they ended up. And so this relatively small scale communal danger where they're at risk of persecution, he thought the idea of God being in control was super comforting. So the idea that anything bad that happened to him and his little group was God's design, and that it, the idea that like everything happens for a reason, that it will lead towards the greater good, for him was super comforting. William says, maybe Calvin was compelled by the idea of control and creating suffering because of the projection of himself onto his image of his God. Interesting. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, John Calvin he confuses me a lot, and I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm supposed to know him pretty well, and I still don't really get him. But yeah, so for him the control thing was helpful. for me, it still just seems very much like one, letting people off the hook when we sin. Well, it's because God made us do it. It's like, I get when people are like, the devil made me do it. It's really weird when people say that God made me do this bad thing. It's just, yeah, I don't get that. But so I'm going to keep going. But this is one way of seeing suffering. But next up, instead of saying that God causes the suffering and orchestrates it, it's instead saying the suffering comes from something else, from some other source, but God can use it to bring about good. So let's go back to John 9, this time when the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned that this man was born blind? And Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. And then he continues, he was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day, blah, blah, blah. This is the NRSV translation, and this is the way this is usually translated, is to have Jesus, from the Greek, is to have Jesus say that, yeah, this guy was not born blind as a punishment. Instead, he was born blind to be inspiration porn, right? He was born blind so that we could learn something about God through his story. Yay! No, I'm not a fan of that, right? Well, if you look at the Greek, and I'll include a link if you want to look at the Greek. I have like a more in-depth thing about this, but basically I see this as being potentially an issue of translation. You absolutely can translate the Greek the way the NRSV and other translations tend to do, but there's an alternative that I talked about with my Greek professor back in seminary, and he agreed with me that because Greek, like the original Greek manuscripts don't have punctuation, that means that we can move the punctuation around. And there's also the word but. There's a Greek word that can mean either but or and it's here in the Greek, but most English translations just kind of leave it out, which can be fine. Again, it's not wrong, but there is an alternative. So my alternative is to have Jesus say, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but in order that the works of God might be revealed in him, we must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day. So the sort of nuance there, for me at least, is that in the first version, God is saying, or Jesus is saying, God made this guy blind so that one day everyone could learn a lesson from his blindness while I heal him, or whatever the heck. In this alternative way, Jesus is saying nobody sinned, and potentially, and he doesn't offer an explanation for what did happen. Why was this guy born blind? Jesus does not say. There's no clarification. But since the guy is blind, like, he can be part of this story of God's works, right? That it's not saying that he only exists in this way in order to be an object of, like, this lesson, but that he, like, it's sort of, in my opinion, like, it's the nuance of sometimes things just happen, and God can sort of take those things and use them for good. It doesn't mean God caused them or willed them or whatever. I do also think, and again, I'll link to like more complexity here, that the idea of blindness at all being seen as inherently suffering is super problematic, but unfortunately that is what we see from most biblical authors, right? Is that things like blindness are inherently suffering, and in their cultural system, that is to an extent the case, that a lot of people who are born blind or deaf or become disabled or whatnot, for a lot of them, especially if they are already poor, right, they're already not rich, begging is one of their only job options. So yeah, there is more complexity, but I do kind of like at least a little nuance. And to continue with the idea that God does not cause suffering, but God can bring goodness out of suffering. A really famous verse from Romans 8, it's verse 28. A common translation is, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God. By itself, I think what that sounds like it's saying is like, it is sort of that everything happens for a reason, or like, don't worry, everything turns out okay in the end. But Dr. Logan Williams on Twitter, I just saw this the other day and was like, oh, this is perfect, is that he says that this traditional translation is incorrect. So not only, like the last one where I said either one could be correct, he's saying that this usual translation is just flat out wrong in the Greek. And again, I'll link to that, but I looked at his Greek work, and I agree that the more correct to the Greek translation would be this literal first is, we know that God co-works with those who love God all things for good. And to make that sound better in English so it actually makes sense, the less rigid translation that Williams comes up with is, God works together with those who love God to direct all things towards the good. So again, like, I think the nuance here is that again, it's not that like God makes the bad thing happen, but and also we're not like objects that God sort of like passively acting around, right? We are the co-workers with God. We are invited to join God in this work of taking the bad and making a blessing come out of it, making good come out of it. So let's see. Annie says, that's the belief I've adopted about suffering, that suffering is not inherently caused by God, but they can work good from it if we are willing to work with God and uplift one another in our suffering. Yeah, that's beautiful. William says, regarding original interpretations, but for the people who don't love God, you should watch it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we're hopefully, like, this section has shown that, like, the Bible does not have one clear answer, right, to the question of suffering. It has a whole lot of different responses. And from Jesus himself, we never see a clear response about the problem of suffering. He tells us what is not the cause, that it's not punishment, but and he tells us what God can do with suffering, that it can be used for good, you know, like on the cross, right? Jesus's death on the cross was senseless, which is like what I talked about in the last live stream. My belief that Jesus should not have had to die on the cross, right? God did not will Jesus's death. That was something brought about by human violence, human powers. But God was able to take this horrific, violent, senseless death and make it matter, because through it, God shows ultimate solidarity with all who suffer in that way, and so on. And again, you can go see that video for more about that, the previous live stream. But yeah, on the topic of the cross and also the resurrection, here's what S. Jocelyn Burnell, who's a Quaker, says about this idea of God sort of taking suffering and making it matter. Burnell says, the resurrection demonstrates the power of God to bring life out of brokenness, not just to take the hurt out of brokenness, but to add something to the world. It helps us to sense the usefulness, the possible meaning in our suffering, and to turn it into a gift. The resurrection affirms me with my pain and my anger at what has happened. It does not take away my pain, it still hurts, but I sense that I am being transfigured. I am being enabled to begin again, to love confidently, and to remake the spirit of my world. For me, I find that, and it sounds like, Annie, you probably do from what you say about your thoughts on suffering, that this feels really meaningful, the idea that God can make pain matter. When it comes to like the psychology of humans, we are meaning-making creatures. When something bad happens to us or to others or to the whole world, we do ask the questions of why it happened, why it matters, and we want to come up with some meaning, some narrative, and that is part of recovery, is coming up with some narrative that works for us. For Burnell, this is her narrative. I do think it's important to like note that just because for Burnell or for me, the idea that something I go through that's horrible can be made to matter and can become part of my bigger story and my transformation, like just because it's meaningful for some of us, that doesn't mean that then if I see someone else suffering, I should tell them, oh, don't worry, like it's like you don't want it to turn into, it's part of a bigger plan, it's going to be great. Like you don't want to dismiss someone's pain, right? Or sort of force what is meaningful to you to be meaningful for them. Yeah, so there's my soapbox on that. Sorry, y'all. Annie says, I gotta go now, but this has been wonderful and therapeutic. Yay. Thank you so much for putting this together. And I love chatting with you all. Yeah, God bless everyone. Yeah, God bless Annie. Thanks for being here. Yeah, man, I gotta get a move on, so sorry, y'all. I can't not talk forever. I don't know how to be concise for the life of me, and also y'all have such great points that you make it hard too. No, just kidding. But yeah, so I'll keep going. I'm gonna pass this a little bit, and y'all can look at the slides later. I think we've kind of been through this. Something similar to the idea of God causing suffering is the idea that it is a test or a lesson we can learn from. The idea that God sends us difficult trials so that we can learn something and be stronger. Someone who is on Twitter, again, Dr. Jen Wolkin, says that this idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that God's like helping you learn with this. Well, Dr. Jen's response is, what doesn't kill you will likely dysregulate your nervous system, trap itself in your body, steal your spirit and your will, kill the hope inside you. I don't know what makes you stronger means, but let's stop glorifying trauma as a life lesson we've been blessed with. So yeah, just some examples of the very physical, embodied bad fruit of this way of thinking about suffering. And again, like the idea that if you are able to find meaning in your own suffering, that can be a really beautiful thing, but forcing other people to see their suffering that way or global suffering that way just ends up telling people that then any like lingering effects of that pain don't matter or whatnot. It's not great. William says, I've always said that the what doesn't kill you makes you stronger sentiment is a mantra, not a maxim. You may choose to apply it to yourself, not a universal rule that you should apply to others. I like that. That you can apply a lot of different sort of ideas to yourself without applying it to other people. Totally. And especially because I think some of these different phrases, like everything happens for a reason and all of that, have different connotations for different people. Part of what meaning an individual finds in it, when they then try to share it with someone else, just share the platitude, that person might have a completely different understanding of it that is painful to them instead. Ella says, sounds a little like the earlier idea of if it's your fault, you have power over it, a way of coping or meaning making under awful circumstances, but not really a healthy one. Yeah. I think for the earlier stuff about trying to have control in the midst of your trauma or the blame, ultimately that isn't healthy in the long run. I do think some of this meaning making for some people, at least from what I've read from Judith Herman and other people who talk about trauma theory, some of this stuff can help with recovery if it's your own choice in how you decide to tell your story. But it's contextual. It depends on the person or the community. I just wanted to share some more of the issues with connecting suffering and virtue, right? Saying that if you're suffering, it means God's trying to teach you a lesson, be happy about it. Something sort of along that same track is explored in Mouse, the graphic novels by Art Spiegelman, about the Holocaust, the Shoah. And as I look at these panels, if anyone has sort of as we move out of looking at suffering this closely, if you have any thoughts about why do a lot of us want to believe that suffering isn't arbitrary, that it's something that we only experience if we deserve it, or it's a lesson we can learn from. Why do so many people seem to sort of take that thought around suffering? These few panels from Mouse show I think the author's sort of character within the story talking to a therapist about the Holocaust and how the protagonist's father survived concentration camps. So the therapist character is saying, so, do you admire your father for surviving? Well, sure. I know there was a lot of luck involved, but he was amazingly present-minded and resourceful. And the therapist replies, then you think it's admirable to survive. Does that mean it's not admirable to not survive? Whoosh. I think I see what you mean. It's as if life equals winning and death equals losing. And the therapist says, yes, life always takes the side of life, and somehow the victims are blamed. But it wasn't the best people who survived, nor did the best ones die. It was random. If anyone has thoughts on that, feel free to share. But for me, I find this a meaningful reminder of like the idea that shit happens, and trying to force reasoning onto the shit that happens is more likely to cause harm to the people who are already suffering than it is to really bring any help, like, so just the caution when we're trying to make meaning of things, to make sure that we're not causing further harm instead. Oh yeah, and then the last one, suffering's no big deal, just focus on heaven, is one other way people look at suffering and try to sort of make it compatible with God being good and powerful and stuff. In Romans 8:18, Paul writes, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." And this was a super common idea for, for instance, white masters to teach their black enslaved person, the enslaved people, that they wanted to sort of convince not to rebel, right? Is to tell them, don't worry, your lot in life in this world is to be enslaved, but in heaven you'll be free and it'll be great, so don't worry about it. Well, a lot of black theologians have a lot to say about that. Noel Leo Erskine, in Decolonizing Theology, A Caribbean Perspective, says, "We are admonished to bear the cross now so that we may wear the crown later. We are instructed to sacrifice and do without shoes now so that we may wear shoes when we get to heaven. But black religion helps us understand that all of God's children need some shoes now, right here on earth." Let's see. Ellis is saying, sounds a little like the earlier idea of it's your fault, you have power over it. Oh yeah, so back, I think, to the mouse panels. A way of coping / meaning making under awful circumstances, but not really a healthy one. It seems like lots of the ideological ideas we get trapped on are about how unpleasant it is to let the world be random and let things happen for no reason. There's a whole subgenre of bluegrass music that's just various variations on life sucks, but on the bright side, I'll die someday. Yeah, gosh, yeah. I totally agree with you about like randomness being really scary. Certainty is nice. Q says, that's also what's hurtful in the makes you stronger motto and inspiration porn stuff. It makes surviving sound like a cool story with a nice morale at the end. Okay, yeah, like, so back to the mouse panels. And I think that's, I've seen some Jewish people online comment on this issue when it comes to like fictional accounts, like stories that people tell about the Holocaust. Non-Jewish people tend to want to uplift the stories that you can tie up in the neat little bow that have a nice morale. When, as Q says, in reality, suffering doesn't have to make you better or inspire people. It just is. Yeah. And choosing to, like, trying to make everything have the neat little morale or happy ending or whatnot. For many people, like, it dismisses their suffering. And yeah, like here, telling black people that don't worry, you'll be free in heaven is pretty clearly just a way to get them to not revolt. And I think that kind of theology does exist, some maybe in less extreme examples a lot of the time, but like that idea of like, don't worry, what happens now in heaven, everything will be fine. And like that can bring hope, right? That like there is an end to your suffering is hopeful, but if it leads to like complacency, it's not as helpful. Q says, or Ella says, Q, yeah, and then if your suffering doesn't wrap up cleanly or teach you anything, you feel like you failed to suffer correctly or like your suffering wasn't real. Yes, I was just, a friend of mine yesterday was talking about a book that they're reading. I'm gonna look really quick to see what it's called. It's called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. And apparently it has like a whole chapter about how like the whole idea that like pain always causes you to grow can be super unhelpful to hear. So that is a book I plan to read soon. It's on my reading list. It's Okay Not to Be Okay. It sounds like it's a good read. So as we finally get to the last side of the triangle that we'll pick at, it is God's power, right? So if evil and suffering exist, and they do, and we don't want to dismiss the reality of evil and suffering, but we do want to claim that God is all good and just, then we have to say something about God's power, right? That God must not be omnipotent or omniscient, all-powerful or all-knowing. And before we dive into this bit, I will note that for most of the responses I found, they really focus on the omnipotence aspect, and they're definitely like intertwined, the idea of God being all-powerful, like being able to do all things, and being all-seeing, all-knowing, that God knows everything that's going on, are definitely intertwined, but it's the power aspect that most of these focus on. So I was curious if anyone has any like thoughts or feelings about a God who's not omniscient. How would you feel, or what are your thoughts on the idea of God not knowing everything or being able to like see everything that's happening? Oh, and the artwork on this slide is a painting that like I cannot find the source for it. Like people have shared it on their WordPresses, but they're not the ones who made it. But I love this painting. It's I believe it's supposed to be an image of Hagar from the book of Genesis, who was terribly abused. She was an enslaved Canaanite woman, and out in the desert when she's basically waiting to die because she's out of food and water, God, or a messenger from God, tells her like, no, I'm with you, you're not gonna die, your son's not gonna die, it's gonna be okay, it's still gonna suck, but things are gonna be okay. And Hagar names God El Roi, which means God sees me, and she is the only person in all of scripture to directly give God a name. And I think that's really powerful, that this woman who is in such a dire situation where human beings and human systems do not care about her and what she's suffering, that she's able to say, God sees me, to name that and believe that even in the midst of continued suffering, that God doesn't lift her out of her suffering. And in the question of omnipotence, does God not save her from suffering because they're not powerful? Are they unable to? Or is there another reason they don't? Either way, while she's not saved from continuing to be in pain and experience bad things, she still says, God sees me. And so for me, the idea of God being omniscient, God, at least, even if God can't or won't do anything about the pain, it's really important to me that God sees the pain and feels it with us. But yeah, and William's saying omniscience is a subsect of omnipotence. No, yeah, I agree with you. Like, it's part of like what God's powers are. But for me, it's sort of like I could see God's omnipotence being limited in other ways and still keeping the omniscience intact, maybe. Yeah, maybe I'm like splitting hairs here. Ella says, I think I'm better able to wrap my head around limited power than limited knowledge. A lot of my understanding of God comes from ideas about words and language and truth. That's true, yeah, that like, especially like the Gospel of John loves calling Jesus hologos, the word, the truth, or so yeah. Ellis says, so it's easier for me to go, sometimes words aren't enough, then sometimes God is not directly equivalent to the concept of truth. And exactly like you're saying, Avery, being seen as a mode of suffering with is hugely important for me. Yeah, so that's why I wanted to throw that out here before getting into different responses from various people who talk about God's power, that they don't go as much into the knowledge thing, and they're definitely like intertwined. But yeah, for me, I would be okay with, like, spoilers, the leg of this triangle that I would be the most happy to like let be wobbly or pick apart is this one, is the power one. I don't care if God's not all powerful as long as God gives a damn, right? I just need to know that God cares and God sees and knows and is with us. That's what is way more important to me. But yeah, one pretty well known, I think, response to and they weren't only talking like the deists, so these philosophers who came out about during the Enlightenment. They were all about rationalism, about thinking things out to discover things about the world. They were responding mainly, I think, to the question of like, does God exist at all? And part of that was suffering. Like, if there's a good, loving God, why is there evil in the world? And so their response is, well, God is like a watchmaker. God made the universe, and it's like very complicated, and like like how a watch has like all these little mechanics and stuff. There's all the gears that move in specific ways. That's how God makes the universe. There's these natural laws that the universe follows. God sets it in motion, and then God backs off and lets it run on its own. And that's why things that like suffering exist, is because God's backed off. God's not gonna get in and like and be hands-on the way, for instance, John Calvin sees God as being the one like doing everything, directing everything that's going on. Deism is the opposite. No, God's super hands-off. Isaac Newton says, well, sometimes God intervenes, that God has to tinker with the mechanism time to time to keep it in good working order. I'm not going to go any further into this one. I just wanted to lay it out there, unless anyone else has thoughts about deism. But it's a pretty, I remember learning about the deists back in like middle school history. So yeah. One thing that going back to David Hume, that guy from before, if you remember, who liked Epicurus and talked about how like it's hard to see God as all good and all that. His argue is that even if the deists did give evidence for a designer, which they don't, it still gives, what did I even write here? One second. It still gives no evidence for the traditional omnipotent, benevolent God. Oh yeah, okay. So he's saying this doesn't actually answer the question of if God is all good. That's sure, whatever. William says, this is the most important popsicle stick to me too, the power one. Mm-hmm. Also, definitely my go-to is belief in a non-intervening God, at least in a traditional sense. Intervention, I acknowledge, is through the Holy Spirit. Oh, okay, interesting. So, like, taking the Trinity as, like, different persons of the Trinity, that it's the Holy Spirit that is the one that's, like, interacting with the world. Sure. Yeah, I think that's fairly common to, have that idea that, like, we see God's interaction in the world through the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And like back in the day through Jesus literally coming to earth. Mm-hmm. Ellis says, lately I've been finding a lot of resonance in conceptualizing God as like the mom who went shopping and left us home alone with some chores to do. I like it. Yeah, and like when I come back, the dishes better be done. All right. I think for me personally, it's something I'm still trying to figure out, like the idea of, I think a lot of this also has to do with the idea of like the world either being enchanted or disenchanted. So the idea of God being like super involved with the world and it being like, so people who believe that like you can pray to God and God will get you a parking spot, that kind of like super hands-on God is not really something that I've ever believed in. But at the same time, the idea of a God who's completely hands-off, especially in later years, has like sort of not felt right to me either. So I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about the idea of God, intervening, like how hands-on God is. But yeah, Laura's messaging me. Sorry, y'all. I'm just telling them we're on the good theology now. If you want to come back, but no pressure. Just wanted to let them know. Because yeah, that's where we're headed next. Is the idea that so yeah, looking at the side of the popsicle sticks, right? That something with God's power. There's this idea that God is omnipotent, but chooses to limit that power, that God could do everything, but they choose not to. And so Alvin Plantinga in 1977 had this book called God, Freedom, and Evil, where he argues for this. He says that one element of God's self-limiting is that God will not act contrary to God's own nature. And so in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, we have this idea that if we are faithless, God remains faithful, for God is not able to deny God's self. So this idea that God is certain things, whether that is faithful, God is love, God is loving, God is just. God isn't going to do anything that would be contrary to God's own nature. That makes sense to me. It reminds me of in Exodus chapters 3 and 4 when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and when Moses asks for God's name, God's response is, I am what I am, or it can be translated, I am what I will be. To me, it's this idea of constancy, that God's core being is existing, and that God will be what God is now, that there's this steadfastness to God, which is something that the enslaved Hebrews desperately needed. They needed, in the face of the kind of like fear and uncertainty that Pharaoh brought them, to have a God who says, I'm steadfast, and I'm not going to tell you one thing one day about myself and then the next day you it's not true anymore. I think for me that's really meaningful. And the second half of God's self-limiting power is that God, like one of the sort of aspects of God's nature is that God is a respecter of free will. God intentionally created human beings with free will, and God's not going to do anything that would get in the way of our free will. And so what Platinga says is, I also don't know if I'm saying his name right. I'm realizing now I should have looked up how to say it. Sorry. But he says, to create creatures capable of moral good, God must create creatures capable of moral evil. So it's this idea that in creating human beings, God's intention is that we are capable of actually choosing good. And part of that is so that we can truly love God. God is, in God's self, a trinity. God is loving relationship and this complete mutuality. Well, God, for whatever reason, decided to, like, in the overflowing of that love, God decided to create an entire cosmos and all sorts of creatures, including human beings, with the sort of idea that human beings would be able to join in that Trinity's relationship of complete, like, mutuality and consensual love. And that's not possible if we don't have free will. In order to for it to actually be love and, like, healthy and not abusive, right, we have to be able to say no just as much as we can say yes, right? And so that means we can say yes to God's love, we can say yes to justice, but we can also say no, right? God wasn't going to do anything to get in the way of that, even though that means that we can say yes to enacting violence on each other. And that's how we are in the mess that we're in today, where humans hurt other humans, and the systems that we've built over many, many, many years cause harm. Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote the book on Job, is really into this idea of a self-limiting God. He says that precisely because human beings are free, they have the power to change their course and be converted. The destruction of the wicked would put an end to that possibility. Oh, yeah, so this is his commentary on why God doesn't just destroy the wicked, right? So we know that, okay, God will not intervene and, like, force people to become good. Gutierrez also says God's also not going to destroy bad people even if they're causing a lot of harm, because that also would impede their free will to eventually have a change of heart. And yeah, he continues, in other words, the all-powerful God is also a weak God. The mystery of divine freedom leads to the mystery of human freedom and to respect for it. So yeah, if anyone has thoughts on that, and don't worry, we are coming close to the end. I know this is a lot. But Elie says, this works well for me, and I think pairs well with the image of a fundamentally vulnerable God that we get in Jesus, a God who was a child, who needs care and receives love and suffering just like we do. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that the vulnerability that God expresses in becoming human speaks to this self-limiting, right? That in Jesus, if nowhere else, we definitely know that in Jesus, God self-emptied, that God did sort of limit their omnipotence and maybe omniscience. So I don't think that the infant Jesus knew everything, right? He had to be taught how to crawl and speak and read and all of that. I think Jesus sort of gives us a lot of evidence for this idea. I did pull in the catechism. Just as we're wrapping up, they sum up some of this, but I'm gonna skip over it just for time's sake. But that's there. And here's the one last thing. So sort of not different from the self-limiting God, but another facet of it that Wendell Farley suggests. She's a theologian still alive and working today, who says that God is all-powerful, but it's not the kind of power that humans expect. That in the kind of societies that, like, for instance, the Western world has built, we view power as domination and control and being completely in charge, and it's a hierarchy. But God's power is actually compassion. That and compassion, if you look at like the etymology of the word, it literally means like suffering together, a co-suffering. This idea that we've brought up before that oh gosh, give me a second. I'm gonna take a drink of water. I'm getting tongue-tied. But yeah, compassion as God's power, the co-suffering and the solidarity of God. Power doesn't have to look the way that our societies have made power look over the years. And of course, when I say our societies, I do think like there are human societies throughout history, and then in some cultures there are some indigenous societies that still exist, despite the fact that the Western world has been trying to stomp them out, that have, I think, an idea of power that is closer to this idea of God's power as compassion or interdependence, working together. But yeah, that's the power of God. And so this kind of power doesn't necessarily intervene and stop bad things from happening, but it will sit with you through the bad things. God will never leave you alone to suffer. That God is in ultimate solidarity, like I mentioned before, with Jesus on the cross being in ultimate solidarity with everyone who has suffered violence at the hands of unjust powers. And so Farley says, compassion is the power that ignites the beauty of a soul after suffering has snuffed it out. It is not an impotent emotion of pity or even sympathy. It is not only companionship in misery. It is the name of a kind of power, the only kind of power that redeems. And I included an art piece here by Linda Richardson titled Jesus Weeps. It's a painting that shows a close-up of Jesus's face, and he looks super distraught. There's tears coming from his eyes, and he's clutching a bundle to his chest, and what that is Lazarus's body. So this is from the story in John, I think chapter 10, 11, or 12 of John. I want to say 11, maybe. But the story of Lazarus, where Jesus is about to raise Lazarus, his friend, from the dead. But even though he knows that, so the idea, right, that people have of, oh, don't worry about suffering, it's going to be good in heaven, Jesus took the time to break down and grieve, even though he knew that in a second, Lazarus will be back and everything would be fine. That doesn't erase the suffering, right? The suffering still happened, the grief was still there, and it doesn't matter that there's going to be joy in the morning. It matters that there's suffering now, and Jesus doesn't erase that. God doesn't erase, but rather redeems that kind of suffering with the power of compassion. So for me, at least, that for me is like, it doesn't answer all the questions about why certain kinds of suffering exist or anything like that, but it does give me some hope and encouragement anyway. And same with this story by William Sloane Coffin Jr. I'll link the full thing, but he had this sort of, I think, like a sermon that he preached sometime after the death of his son. His young adult son died in a car crash, so if you don't want to hear about a death by car crash, I would leave for like just 2 minutes and then come back. But here's what he says. Oh yeah, and right before this part that I'm going to read, he talks about how a lot of people, in their attempt to comfort him, said a lot of the sort of unhelpful cliches like, oh, well, you know, God works in mysterious ways and everything happens for a reason. And he says, yeah, none of that was helpful, guys. You literally, all you had to do was just tell me that you're sad too and sit with me in my grief. That's all you had to do, guys. But this is what he says. God does not go around this world with his finger on triggers, his fist around knives, his hands on steering wheels. God is dead set against all unnatural deaths. The one thing that should never be said when someone dies is, it is the will of God. Never do we know enough to say that. My own consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God for Alex to die. That when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's heart was the first of all our hearts to break. That bit always gets me at the end, because yeah, like that idea of the compassion and that it's God's grief. Yeah, if anyone else has thoughts, I see that some of you are saying like, "Ooh, yes, this is powerful," and Ella says, "Yes, we just assume that power equals dominance." Yeah. So if we can reimagine God's power in different ways, as interdependence, as compassion, as vulnerability, how will that impact our ideas about power in our own world, in our own individual lives, and on social levels? If we could start reimagining power, what would change? So one other response as we're moving to, so we're out of the sort of attempts to, as Wendy Farley put it, to jerry-rig this triangle, moving out of that into the idea that we aren't going to have all the answers, and like this guy, what Sloan Coffin Jr. says, that we don't know enough to even pretend we have the answers about where God is all the time, right? And trying to make stuff up is often unhelpful. In the face of not knowing all the answers, what do we do? Elie Wiesel says, we wrestle God, and so do a lot of other people, including in the Bible. We see Habakkuk from the beginning, right? And psalmists and Jesus himself wrestling God when we don't know why suffering happens, but we like are impacted by it. We are welcome to ask and to demand answers. And this story, and again, so I think the next like 5 minutes I'll be talking about the Holocaust. So if that's difficult for you, just head out for 5 minutes and go get yourself a snack, take a break, and come on back. And we'll be wrapping up after this anyway. But Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz as a kid, as a teenager, and later he wrote a play called The Trial of God about his experiences there. And he actually set it in a fictional setting of like I think 1800s town that faces a pogrom. How do you say that? Pogrom. But then there was a movie adapted that set it back in where he was inspired at a concentration camp called God on Trial. But this is what inspired him is this story. He says that as a teen in Auschwitz, I witnessed a strange trial. 3 rabbis, all erudite and pious men, decided one winter evening to indict God for allowing his children to be massacred. I remember. I was there and I felt like crying, but nobody cried. And then he continues and explains that this trial lasted several nights, and different inmates or people in the camp brought, like, shared their witness, whether for or against God, and evidence. And then at the end of this trial, there was a unanimous verdict. The Lord God Almighty was found guilty of crimes against creation and humankind for letting what happened to the Jewish people and all of the others who died in the Holocaust. For letting that happen, God's guilty for crimes against humanity. Or maybe not quite guilty. What Elie Wiesel ends with is saying that at the end of the trial, the word they used is actually the word chayav, which doesn't quite mean guilty. What it means is he owes us something. So this idea that whether or not God is guilty, God definitely owes these people something, whether that is to intervene and save them, or whether it's simply to send a message to say, yes, this is wrong, or yes, this sucks, or yes, I'm suffering with you. Anything. God owes them anything at all is the verdict. And I don't know, this story like never fails to just sort of stop me in my tracks. To close it, and I first heard this story in Miguel de la Torre's book, Embracing Hopelessness. I'll link to I have like excerpts from the book that I've like shared on my Tumblr blog, so if you don't want to read the whole book, you can like look through my excerpts from this book. I find it really, really interesting stuff. He is a liberationist theologian, contemporary, and yeah, so his thoughts about this story is he wraps up that Elie Wiesel after saying that these people found God, that God owes them something. Right after that, after they come to that verdict, the time comes for evening prayers, and everybody who just found God guilty begins to pray. Wiesel says that there was an infinity of silence. And then one of the scholars looked up and said, "It's time for evening prayers," and the members of the tribunal recited the evening service. And De La Torre comments upon that, saying, "They defiantly embrace who they are while still remaining in heated conversation, damning God. It matters not if God still hears their prayers, or if there even is a God to hear. They still pray, they still debate, not for God's sake, but for their own." Yeah, I feel like that speaks for itself, but if anyone has any comments about either how that makes you feel, or thoughts you have about that, feel free to share. For me, it's just like, it's a lot, it's a lot, but just, wow. Yeah. And to continue with one last story that talks about this idea of like God in our suffering is from Sister Macrina Wiederkehr. She's a Catholic nun. She died just a few years ago. I find her for my own like personal faith life. Her books are super, super meaningful for me. Her argument is that when we question God, and we should, so she agrees that yes, wrestle with God, question God, and God echoes our question back at us. So here's her little story about one night. She says, "I clasped the newspaper to my heart like a Bible. I weep over the tragedy of human life. This morning with Psalm 102 I prayed, 'The children of those who serve you shall dwell secure.' I smiled a cynical smile because, God, we both know this isn't true. So many people who serve you do not dwell secure, and neither do their children. I say to you, what's happening to their prayers, God? Are you using their prayers for a carpet in heaven? Well, they aren't in heaven. These people need for you to lean down from heaven. I see the misery human beings suffer, and I say in regard to all this, it is enough. It is enough, God. Where do you hang out when your people are starving?" In the shadows of the dark night, I seem to see God leaning down from heaven. God repeats to the human race my own agonizing cry. It is enough. How long must I wait for you to put on the mind of Christ? How long must I wait for you to live in my image? What are you doing with the prayers of your brothers and sisters? Are you making them into plush carpets for your own feet to rest on? So, yeah, this idea that we can and we should ask questions of God, and then God's gonna ask us the same questions right back and ask us, what the heck are you doing? And that's where we're gonna end, is this idea of keep asking the questions and then do something about it. That whatever sort of ideas you come up with about suffering, you know that the ideas are good, that the theology is sound, if it spurs you not to complacency, not to despair or acceptance that suffering happens, but to action and to solidarity with the suffering. So, yeah, in the face of not knowing all the answers, we should focus on doing. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who is also an incredible guy who also just passed away a few years ago, he says that when he was asked why suffering exists, he says, God does not want us to understand why suffering happens, because if we ever understood, we would be forced to accept that bad things happen to good people, and God does not want us to accept those bad things. God wants us not to understand so that we will fight against the bad and the injustices of the world. So yeah, to him, it's, again, you can ask the questions, but if you are led to resignation, something's off. You gotta get moving, get active. So yeah, last quote. I have an art piece on this slide by Kelly Lattimore that shows the homeless Christ. So it's a figure who is meant to be Jesus. He has a long beard and he has a halo behind him, and he's also wearing a red hoodie and has a blue blanket around his shoulders, and he's sitting on the sidewalk and has a cardboard sign that says homeless, anything helps, with a cup to receive money. And so the last quote talks about this idea of God with the power of compassion, doesn't just compel us to move in solidarity, but is literally one of us. Alan Bosak says, "The cries of the poor and the oppressed are the cries of God." That means that not only God hears those cries, or that God has implanted those cries in the hearts of those who cannot bear injustice, but that God becomes the poor and the oppressed and the downtrodden. So when we respond to the cries of the poor and the oppressed in the world, we are responding to the agony of God, to the outrage of God. We are responding to the wounding of God. John Calvin, and it cracks me up that John Calvin's back with something good to say. John Calvin says that undoing injustice is healing the wounds of God. So yeah, that's the end, y'all. We made it. Holy crap. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to be concise for the life of me. I think next time I'll chop up, if I have a big topic like this, I'll chop it up into smaller pieces. But I also think that my ideas for future live streams are smaller ideas. For instance, looking at the differences between gospel writers, and then what was brought up, Adam and Eve and the fall and original sin. So yeah, if any of y'all have ideas for what you'd like to see next, feel free to let me know. In the meantime, if anyone has any closing thoughts or questions, want to say any just last ideas, what resonated with you, feel free to do so. And then I'll end this, but it was really fun. Thank you for those